Welcome back. This is the Vanguard Elements podcast. My name is Aldo Mena, and I'm joined tonight by my co-host Steve Cianez, the Senior State Policy Strategist for Unidos US and California. He's joining us tonight from the Los Angeles area, and I'm also very pleased to be joined tonight by Chelsea Vega, a content creator and independent journalist who is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona tonight. Welcome to the podcast, Chelsea.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm actually in LA today. I
Oh,
I had a
wow.
quick, I know, I had a quick
Hmm.
flight today to get
Okay.
here a little bit early for some work. So I'm
Oh, okay,
also in the
cool.
Los Angeles area.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice.
Interesting. Cool. Okay. So I really appreciate, both of you guys taking the time to join the conversation tonight. Chelsea, I'm really looking forward to discussing your latest article for LA Taco in our main segment a little later. We'll be doing that probably in about 10, 15 minutes or so. But to start the conversation tonight, I feel compelled to ask you a very important question, Chelsea. Are you a Sun Devil? Did you go to ASU? I'm sorry. Yeah, did you go to
I
Arizona State
am.
University? Oh, cool.
I am. I
Neat.
graduated several years ago at this point.
Wow.
But WP Carey School of Business, I majored in marketing. I actually double majored, so I also have an undergrad degree in psychology.
Hmm.
So yeah, kind of a mix of both. But yeah, Sun Devil for sure.
Wow. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Tempe, ASU, very cool. They have a really interesting program out there called the School of Trans-Border Studies, which focuses on the peoples, cultures, politics, economies, and histories of the U.S.-Mexico borderland. So very innovative program there. Have you guys ever heard of a guy by the name of Lalo Alcaraz?
I have not.
Okay.
I'd love to know. Yeah, I have not. Tell me
Yeah,
about
no,
him.
he's this Mexican American Chicano political cartoonist, and ASU really gives him some very generous support. I think
Okay.
he's the artist in residence at ASU's downtown Los Angeles campus.
Really?
So yeah, and he's got some sort of connection to ASU itself in Phoenix, but they really offer him some patronage and support
Yeah.
for his work, which is pretty. If you get a chance, check out his some of his cartoons. He doesn't mince words. I mean, he comes
Yeah.
out and he says what he wants to say.
I feel like he sounds familiar. I may have seen his stuff on Instagram now that
Yes,
you bring him up as like a political cartoonist. I feel
right.
like I've seen his work on there. So I'm gonna have to check him out because I'm not too familiar, but he sounds familiar.
Yeah, no, he's if you get a chance, check him out. He's excellent.
Yeah.
Very interesting guy. Um, so I spend a lot of time in Arizona, mainly Mesa, and lots of cool things coming through Arizona. Lots of good rock
Yeah.
concerts. I think I saw Nine Inch Nails there a while
Okay.
back. But there's always a good rock concert going on in Mesa,
Yeah.
so that's cool. But it's still one of those places that I'm trying to figure out. It's hard to really generalize about Arizona, politically speaking, right?
Yeah.
You've got these big blue cities, you've got Phoenix, you've got Tucson, and then you have these other places that are sort of
More
kind of
conservative.
MAGA.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
don't know, still figuring it
Yeah,
out.
for sure, for sure. Well, originally, I'm from LA, and
Mhm.
so, I come from a very blue state. And so I came to Arizona when I was pretty young, and so but I feel like I've grown up here, right? I came to Arizona when I was like 10 years old. And so I feel like I've gotten so accustomed to the culture that when I travel to LA and I'm like amongst people that are more liberal, I'm like, oh, it is really more conservative in Arizona. I
Yes.
think it depends like where you go. Like when I attended ASU, right? For example, people are very liberal there, right? And I think you find that a lot in college campuses. But I think in my adult life, like in corporate institutions or, just among people, in like the workplace, I found that a lot of people are conservative, and I think that it depends on the city. But I would consider Arizona maybe like a purple state, is what I think a lot of people call it, right? It's kind of like one of those swing states where it could be blue, it could be red. But I think just because of the general, a lot of people are not from Arizona originally. I think we've had a lot of people come over here, and I think it's kind of turning a little more liberal,
Mm,
little by little. But I don't think it's quite there yet.
Right.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's things that can be kind of deceiving. I mean, you have a Democratic governor, two
Yeah.
Democratic senators, and I really like Senator Mark Kelly. I think he's interested in running for president, and I think he'd be a viable candidate for sure. I think he's taking some shit right now because he wore a Mexico jersey to a Mexico watch party in Tucson.
Oh God.
And so
And
people are
people weren't.
complaining, why are you wearing a Mexico jersey? But, he doesn't give a shit. I mean, he faces off with Trump all the time.
Yeah.
I like Ruben Gallego too. I like your attorney general, right? She's always giving Trump a lot of trouble. Um, there's also, as far as congressional reps are concerned, Yasmin Ansari, she's pretty
Hmm.
cool. Greg Stanton, but one of my favorite political figures anywhere is Adelita Grijalva from, I
Yeah.
Hmm.
think it's CD7, right?
Yeah.
And she's a fighter, and I really like her. I think she took over the seat from her late
Yep.
father or
Her
something.
dad.
So
Yeah.
yeah. In her first speech on the floor of the U.S. House after being sworn in, I think she spoke Spanish and then she identified herself as the first Chicana from Arizona ever to go to Congress. So that's pretty bold of her. So that's
That
cool. Yeah.
that is. And I think like in general, we don't have too much representation, right? And so seeing her, especially as a woman, is I think really empowering. And I think we need more voices like her. I think we need more people to, truly represent ourselves. I think a lot of people represent us in a, how can I say it without without sounding too harsh, but I think a lot of people that go into politics kind of have this like very conservative nature to them. And I think that she brings like this perspective that's like just for the people and that's more representative of us who are kind of like bicultural and, still appreciate our culture, are also American, but also still have an appreciation for our culture. So I love what she's doing and what she represents and just proud to see it.
Oh, absolutely. And what I'm about to say is going to sound really weird coming from me. But before we move on, I just wanted to acknowledge three honorable Republicans from the state of Arizona. The late Senator John McCain, uh,
Okay.
Senator Jeff Flake. This is back when there was a Republican Party. I don't know if you guys can
Mm.
remember that, but this is,
Hmm.
there was a Republican Party once, believe it or not. Flake has wrote some very compelling editorials and this is early on in the Trump phenomenon. He wrote some editorials, I think it was for Washington Post, basically calling upon his fellow Republicans to resist Trump. And at the time, and he acknowledged this is probably the end of my political career, but I'm urging all Republicans to stand against this guy. And he ended up retiring from the Senate or whatever. But and I also just wanted to quickly mention John Giles. He's a Republican, okay,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
former mayor of Mesa, and he wants to bring an MLS soccer team to Arizona, which I would love, and I think would definitely work there. In 2020, he endorsed Biden, and in 2024, he endorsed Kamala Harris. And of course, people freaked out on the guy because he's a Republican in Mesa. But he was one of those, I like to call them John McCain Republicans, Arizona
Hmm.
Republicans. There was a time when that meant something. And so, I kind of miss Republicans like this. Didn't agree
Yeah.
with everything they supported, but I have to acknowledge their courage in the face of Trump and what's going on now with the Republican Party.
I think you make a really interesting point, and it's that there is a difference between being conservative and having conservative beliefs and also being MAGA. I think that there is,
Oh yeah.
being a Trump supporter, completely different because I think you're right. Like, I think when I think of the Republican Party 10 years ago, very, very different than what it is now. So I think that is an important distinction. I feel like personally, I actually do not like to be boxed in. We had this conversation
Yes.
separately that like I have no party affiliation because I just don't like to be boxed into any party, really. Like I like to make my decisions and my beliefs based off of, single ideas and, who I think makes the most sense. And so I think it's just a really good point that you bring up, that there is a difference in being a conservative and, a Trump supporter, as we
No,
mentioned.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I don't know do we even call them the Trump movement Republican anymore? I mean, I don't know.
Uh,
I don't
it's
even
a
know if it's
question,
conservative. Yeah. So,
right? It's a big question. Yeah.
yeah, lots of interesting stories coming out of Arizona, but just really quick, have you heard of a Mexican restaurant called Xolo in North Phoenix?
Um, Not a restaurant. There is a coffee shop
Oh,
called
okay.
Sholo. Yeah, but
Okay.
not the restaurant. Why? What about the restaurant?
Because there's a Mexican restaurant, and check out
Okay.
Phoenix New Times, called Xolo, Xolo, I think, and it's in
Yeah,
North
yeah,
Phoenix. And
yeah.
the thing about them is they're these kind of gung-ho Trump supporters. So you go into the restaurant and
Oh.
there's a bunch of Trump pictures and stuff like that.
Oh my God.
And so there was a
It's
lot of controversy, but here's the punchline, okay, to this little situation. It's owned by a same-sex couple, which is cool, which is fine. But one of them's from Mexico, the other guy's not,
Mm.
but it's a same-sex couple, so people are just scratching their heads and wondering. And like I said, nothing wrong with being a same-sex couple,
no, not at all.
whatever. But it's just mind-boggling that they're so. And I think they had to, report people to the FBI. So you got to be careful if you go there. I went and tried to take a picture of it
Oh
so I could write an
wow.
art, but
Yeah,
you got to be careful because they're,
interesting.
they're a little touchy, but MAGA to the rescue. MAGA came along, kept them in business. And there's a
Yeah,
couple of little
interesting.
restaurants like this in the Phoenix area. There's also Tortas Manantial.
I was
Have you heard
I
about
was
that one?
just
Okay.
about to bring them up. I was like, "Oh, it sounds like tortas manantial." But here's the thing, the Latino community, they canceled them. I mean,
Yes.
they came
Yeah.
after tortas manantial, and I'm not
Yes.
really sure that MAGA supporters came to the rescue for them, to be honest.
Not on that one,
Um,
no.
yeah, but it's interesting, the restaurant that you bring, Xolo, because it sounds very contradictory. Kind of reminds me of a Latino who's an ICE agent. It's very
It's a
contradictory.
good
An
segue to our main
oxymoron.
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
And then there's
Like peace in
one
the Middle
more.
East, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, and there's one more called Sammy's Mexican Food in Catalina, which is just north of Tucson.
Hmm.
And these guys, I
Okay.
mean, you go in there. Um, I've never gone in there, full disclosure, but I hear that it's just jam-packed with ICE agents and Border Patrol agents and law enforcement. And this guy's openly, pro-Trump, and it's MAGA to the rescue because people are trying to, boycott the business and stuff. But once again, here's another Mexican-owned business catering to
Yeah.
certain elements of the political spectrum. Anyways, that's a whole different conversation for some other time.
Yeah.
Like I said, lots of interesting things going on in Arizona. Let's go ahead and take our first break, and we will be right back to continue our conversation with Chelsea Vega. You are listening to Vanguard Elements. Welcome back. We are joined tonight by content creator and independent journalist Chelsea Vega. First of all, Chelsea, congratulations on your latest article for LA Taco entitled Pedro arrests Juan. Why Latinos join Border Patrol and ICE.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you.
yeah,
That
very
was
Great
interesting
that
story.
was
article. Yeah.
a mind-boggling conversation that I had with, so many people, and I think specifically with the Border Patrol agent or former Border Patrol agent, I should say, that is like the main, part of the article. Very interesting conversation.
Wow. Yeah, I'm happy to hear that you are working with LA Taco because it's a publication that I've mentioned on several occasions on this show, actually.
Really?
About a year
Okay.
ago, I guess the Washington Post, well, we all remember what was going on about a year ago, right, in LA. And
Hmm.
initially, LA Taco was just, they covered cannabis issues and tacos in Southern California. Still very cool. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. Still very
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
But then along comes what I call, and I know I'm stealing this name from a Rage Against the Machine album, but I call it the Battle of Los Angeles, right? And that's
Okay.
when Trump invaded LA, right? And Steve, you
Mm,
remember that. You were there,
of
right?
course, yeah.
Hmm.
Out
He
there waving the
deployed
flag.
Marines.
Hmm. Hmm.
He
Hmm.
nationalized the California National Guard. Just in response to peaceful protests. And
Right.
so it was one of those things that suddenly there's this situation that LA is thrust into, and LA Taco just rose to the occasion and evolved into something else, and they've been doing it ever since. So
Yeah.
that's cool that you're working with them, right?
Yeah, it's interesting to see their evolution because they came on my radar around that time. Maybe a little bit before that, maybe like a year and a half ago, they came on my radar. And then they just evolved to covering all of these ICE issues. And honestly, I don't want to speak for them. This is, my personal opinion of where I see them going, right? Is I think that they're going to evolve to just continue to cover more Latino issues, representative of Los Angeles. But I think that they just have the opportunity to evolve even past that, like a Los Angeles Times kind of, but more from like a street journalism perspective. But yeah, I really enjoy them, and that's why I actually went directly to them when I wanted to pitch them the story, because I was like, I just felt that there was a lot of synergy. It's almost like it feels grassroots, if that makes sense. Like their kind of like level of journalism. Like I just feel like they're about the people, and the lens that they bring, I think just resonates with me a lot. So I'm thankful that they gave me the opportunity for that piece.
No, absolutely. Yeah, they seem kind
Right.
of guerrilla, and that's great.
Yeah,
That's what I
that's a
like
good
about
word.
them,
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
independent guerrilla and
Hmm.
not beholden to anyone. They're gonna write about what they want to write about, and that's so cool. I love it.
Yeah, I
Very
not to say
independent.
too much, but yeah, for sure. But I was like, when I reached out to him, I was like, I love that you guys just like don't pander to anyone. Like you guys just write what you write. And they're
Hmm.
like, yeah, we don't pander to anybody. We just kind of we say the truth. Like we write what we want to write. And I fuck with that.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Hmm.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, like I mentioned earlier, your latest article for LA Taco is entitled "When Pedro Arrests Juan: Why Latinos Join Border Patrol and ICE." And before we begin, I was just going to offer a couple of quick disclaimers, just so nobody gets the wrong, and any of our listeners don't, get the wrong impression. During a pre-production conversation, you and I both acknowledged that Border Patrol and ICE are two very different agencies. And so we agreed not necessarily to limit our conversation, but to acknowledge that distinction and understand that ICE in its current formulation under Trump is something different than it was, 2 or 3 years ago. So we just want our listeners to understand that we understand the distinction as well. Um, you know, ICE has justifiably faced intense criticism over its aggressive enforcement tactics, detention practices, alleged violations of immigrants' due process and civil rights.
Mhm.
It's faced criticism over documented cases in which Mexican Americans were detained, arrested, questioned, and harassed. And of course, we can never forget the outrages that ICE is alleged to have committed in Minneapolis and other places. And as we were sort of discussing earlier, an ICE agent was recently involved in a fatal shooting of a Mexican
Hmm.
national in Houston, Texas. So
Mm.
tensions are running high. And we just want to acknowledge that, we understand what ICE is. And so our conversation in no way endorses or condones ICE and
For sure.
their sort of aggressive enforcement tactics. Okay. Um, anyways, so Chelsea, in your article, you acknowledge, as other analysts have acknowledged, that one of the primary reasons Mexican Americans seek employment with law enforcement agencies such as the U.S. Border Patrol is the pursuit of stable, gainful employment. Okay. So, that's
Yep.
fair enough. Employment, that sounds reasonable. And to be honest with you, one of the cruel ironies of life in places like El Paso and the Rio Grande Valley, and maybe even southern Tucson, is that work with law enforcement agencies like Border Patrol may be one of the few economic opportunities available to many Mexican Americans, especially Mexican Americans
Exactly.
who may not, for whatever reason, be inclined to go to college. I mean, and El Paso, Rio Grande Valley, Southern Arizona, we're not talking about booming Phoenix, one of the emerging tech
100%.
markets where there's all these jobs and stuff like that for the educated, right? We're talking
Right.
about, areas where there aren't a lot of jobs. And, I love El Paso and I love, the Rio Grande Valley. I love the San Antonio area, but these are economically challenged parts of the country. And sometimes the only path out is through law enforcement and Border Patrol. But okay,
100%.
having, now that we've acknowledged that, as you point out in your article, it's not that simple. There may be other factors that motivate Mexican Americans to seek out employment with these types of law enforcement agencies. Would you mind elaborating a bit on some of the other factors that you referenced in your article?
Yeah, I do want to go back a little bit to the economic opportunity piece of it, just because I remember when having the conversation with Dr. Mora and Dr. Vega that they really emphasized to me that economic opportunity was a huge piece of it. And the reason why is because systemically, right, as you've kind of already mentioned, but I just want to emphasize that Latinos, Mexican Americans, we don't have the traditional pathways to, let's say corporate America as many people who have been here for generations, right? And so, like you mentioned, in these border towns, let's say, like, for example, Alejandro, which is the former Border Patrol agent that I interviewed, he was from Nogales, Arizona. So when you think of Nogales, it's not Hollywood, you know what I mean? And so I think that the opportunities are limited. And so a lot of people in these or these border towns, the federal government provides that stability. It provides like, you know, that pathway into the middle class. And for a lot of people who are immigrants, who a lot of people who are first generation here, that pathway into the middle class is what you're really searching for. It's part of our safety, right? And so, it really does have to do like, economic opportunity is a big piece of why people join. And I think it's on a greater scale, something systemic. We just don't have access to these opportunities. Like, I'm going to give you an example. Like, when I got into corporate America, I really think about how lucky I was to make it into my background is in professional sports marketing. And so I worked for the NBA, specifically within the Phoenix Suns, for a few years. And I think about that and I think about how lucky I was to have applied for the position, interviewed, and gotten it. When most people have a dad who works in, let's say, oh, my dad works for this company and he's the president of this. And so he made a call to his friend. And, that's how I got into it. So I just feel like economic opportunity is a big piece of it. And the reason why I didn't focus on it in the article too much, but I wanted to make sure to emphasize it, is because a lot of these articles that have already covered the subject focus on that economic opportunity piece. And so within my article, I really wanted to dive into more of the sociological lens and kind of like think about the history of being Latino in this country, the history of being Mexican American, the history of colonialism, and, kind of like maybe provide kind of like an analysis of like kind of bringing everything together and to talk about how the issue is not it's not just like, oh, this is why they do it, it's a very layered issue. And so my article really dives into the historical analysis of it, but also from a lens of what makes you want to belong to the United States? Like, where does that come from? And so I think that that's kind of the lens that kind of dominates my article.
Sure, it sure does. And Minna, I don't know if I can jump in here and ask her a
Sure.
question because since we're on the topic of belonging, and I think you do a fabulous job on, approaching and analyzing the issue of belonging um, in such a compacted manner because it's not a long article that you got here.
Right.
But when I was reading your story, I was thinking about Mexican writer Octavio Paz and his Laberinto de la Soledad, a masterpiece that explores the Mexican identity and culture and the quest for purpose and meaning in a world that's constantly changing.
Mhm.
Now I know that Octavio Paz, we know this, that he was writing in the 40s and the 50s, right? And times have changed since then. Um, but I believe there are universal and contemporary themes such as
Mhm.
identity,
Mhm.
culture, and belonging that are still relevant today, as they were almost 75 years ago, and even before that, right? And in your story, Alejandro is a living testament to how these themes are still playing out with Mexican Americans, especially, I would say, among men.
Mhm.
Um, and Octavio Paz dedicates a chapter in his book to explore the Mexican American experience, now specifically Mexican American experience, and it describes how the Pachuco of the 40s and 50s is a symbol of cultural alienation and
Mhm.
existential loneliness. He dives deep. He also implicitly describes Pachuco as a male issue as opposed to
Interesting.
openly acknowledging that Mexican American females were also pachucas. I mean, there's pachucos and
Hmm.
pachucas, right?
For sure.
And he writes that pachucos are both lost and trapped between two cultures. One culture being the dominant one over the other, in this case, Anglo America, right? And that they were lost in the sense they were neither from here nor there, which is also part of your article, ni de aquí ni de allá, right?
Hmm.
Something that you bring up in the story.
Yes.
So in essence, I think Paz describes them as orphans who lost their culture, language, religion, customs, and so on. So my question after saying all this is do you think that his description fits the likes of Mexican Americans like Alejandro Gonzalez? And are Mexican American women any different?
That's an interesting question. I absolutely think he fits. I think the Mexican American experience, which I like to focus on that, right? Because we're all Mexican, right? So I think that that's the lens that we can speak to the most. I am obviously a woman, so I can definitely relate to that. Ni de aquí ni de allá is like something that I think is like deeply buried within Mexican American culture. Like it's something that's just so profound that we can really relate to because when we're in America, we grew up in the United States. I don't know about you guys, I'm bilingual, but I'm English dominant. You know what I mean? Like I think in
Mm-hmm.
English. I think in English, and when I speak Spanish, I translate, from English to Spanish. I was educated here. I grew up on hip hop and pop and also Spanish music. I mean, I grew up bicultural, you know what I mean? But in America, I've always been told that I'm Mexican. And I remember like, traveling to Mexico. I'm sure if you guys have traveled to Mexico, being told in Mexico that we're American. And, we just like sit at this intersection where we're not really accepted by either group. And that really is what ni de aquí, ni de allá means, right? Like, neither from here nor from there, is that neither group really accepts us. And so I think what's interesting with the story of Alejandro, who I talked to, is that's one of the themes that immediately came up during the first, 10 minutes of our conversation, right? I remember during in our interview, I asked him his family background. Where's your mom from? Where are your grandparents from? Where's your dad from? And there was this like there was this pride in saying we are from the United States, which was very
Mm.
interesting to me, right? Because I think there is like whenever you think of like nationalism or kind of being more, I'm not going to say he's conservative. I'm not going to assign him any political beliefs, right? But when you think of like Trump supporters, let's say, and I'm not saying he's a Trump supporter, but when you think of them and the intersection between Mexican Americans and Trump supporters, there usually are more nationalists. Like they're more like, I'm proud to be American, and you're kind of like distancing yourself from your Mexican roots, which is very interesting to me, because it's like it's almost like you're having to choose, like it's almost like you're having to be like, I am American. And it's ultimately, in my opinion, because of the fact that we're just not accepted. You know what I mean? As Latinos, as Mexican Americans. Not to go too much on a tangent, but like Bad Bunny's halftime show, like that, if that's not an example of how we're constantly told that we are not American, I don't know what is, because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory.
Yeah.
Like so
Yeah.
it's just this constant having to prove what you are,
Yeah.
or live between both countries.
No, absolutely. Very
Right.
interesting. Many of us have confronted the same reality, right? That these Mexican American, Alejandro has confronted. And yet some of us, and for the record, I'm a third generation Mexican American. I speak English, that's my dominant language. I have to translate to Spanish. Um, but we've confronted, the same reality, and yet we didn't run for the hills, and we didn't feel compelled to validate ourselves, as Americans, by joining a certain profession or aligning ourselves with MAGA. Some of us have reacted very differently, and I always point
Mm.
to the Battle of Los Angeles that I mentioned earlier, because people are like, "Oh, how dare these undocumented Mexican immigrants, protest and wave the flag?" And I go, "No, no, no, no. Those weren't undocumented Mexican immigrants out there.
Right,
Those were
right.
Mexican Americans out there waving the Mexican flag."
Right.
Um, and so some of us, you write articles, you also do some really funny content, kind of poking fun at ICE. It's funny. Um, and we do podcasts and we try to start nonprofits and stuff like that. But do you think there is an element? I mean, why are we reacting a certain way, and why are other people, when they're faced with this dissonance and they feel
Mm,
this rejection, why do they feel compelled to validate themselves? And some of us use it as an opportunity. I'm fine if they don't think I'm an American. That's cool. I don't need them to define American for me. And
yeah.
it's one of those, is it insecurity? I mean, what's at the core of this need to validate themselves,
Yeah.
in your
You know,
opinion?
I think that's an interesting question. And, I can't speak for people at the end of the day. I think my take on it is there are effects to colonialism, right? And I think that historically, colonialism has forced many people to assimilate for safety, right? if you look at, and I mentioned this in my article, if you look at the Spanish caste system afforded opportunities and legal protections to people who more closely were able to tie themselves to European culture or being white, essentially, right? If you're not familiar and you're listening, the Spanish caste system was like a racial hierarchy during the colonial period that existed amongst Latin America. And essentially, the Spanish colonizer was different than the English colonizer, right? Like the English colonizer relied more on segregation, extermination, the one drop rule within race. So very heavy on segregation. And in Spanish colonization, they also exterminated people and they were also very cruel. And, I'm not making excuses for any of them, but they relied more heavily on this racial hierarchy and encouraged people to mix and to become more European, right? And so there was almost this like way to climb yourself to the top. The more you aligned yourself with European culture, European white. And so I think for generations, what that's told our people is that the closer you are to being white, the more safety or opportunity that you may have. Now, I don't think that people think this explicitly, right? I think it's like an implicit thing that's just been like, you think about racism now, like racism isn't overt, people aren't calling other people racial slurs left and right. It's not as heard of. Discrimination comes in different forms in more implicit ways. And so I think that that still exists within us. I think that there are people who will align themselves with the dominant power structure for safety, right? And so I don't think that they're thinking about it that way. I just think it's something that it's like a legacy that we've of colonialism that we've inherited. And even like when you think about more recently, let's say when the United States inherited the Mexican territory, you think about the people that were here, the Mexicans who overnight became Americans, right? Or became Americans, quote unquote, because we know that, we weren't granted, all of the legal opportunities that we should have been given. But when you
Yes.
think about those people, they were subject to, again, discrimination based off being, Mexican, because your last name is Garcia or Gonzalez or whatever it may be. And so there was this pressure to assimilate. And so I think that that still exists today, even though it may not be, something that people actively think about. I think that there's just this like safety to aligning yourself with that, the power structure, the dominant power structure. That's my
Right.
take.
No, no, interesting. Yeah. No, it's a very complicated thing that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's
Hmm.
right now it's just, just any observations we might have. Um, Another implication of your article that I appreciated is that you acknowledge that, Mexican Americans will engage in certain types of behavior to validate themselves as Americans or to sort of, prove something to another segment of the American society. So,
Hmm.
outside of the realm of employment with Border Patrol, um, Mexican American Trump supporters, I think, might be engaging in a similar type of behavior to validate themselves as Americans. And I think you might have mentioned this earlier, and
Hmm.
perhaps in the process, distance themselves from the targeted group.
Hmm.
And I don't mean to be, dismissive or, to make fun of anybody, but have you guys noticed that some of the people who are, the most ardent Trump supporters are, I guess in Spanish there's a word called nopalero, right? I mean,
Mm.
these are
Oh,
people
interesting.
who they seem and this is fine, they're maybe first generation immigrants, maybe not as assimilated as some of us are. And so maybe under, faced with this kind of pressure, they feel the need to validate themselves to some segment of the American population by showing people that guess what? We hate those people too. We're just like you and we're not them. So I noticed, Trumpism has sort of shown us who we are as a people. Some people, immediately sort of, they bowed down to the pressure and, aligned with Trump. Others, not so much. And so I've seen great things occur, and then I've seen things that make me wonder about some elements of our community. And that's one of them. And I'm just wondering, I mean, and Steve, you feel free to chime in on this. Do you think this reflects a sense of insecurity? In other words, we don't need to resort to looking at political issues to explain what's going on. What's going on is they're kind of insecure. And as a result, when they're confronted with this hostility, um, what they do is instead of standing up, they decide to go ahead and scurry on over to the other side and try to show just how different they are from the targeted group. I don't know. What do you
Yeah,
guys
no,
think?
I mean, and I just, I mean, I agree, right? I mean, I think history um, teaches us, right, through stories that are very, very compelling and that we still somehow repeat and share with the generation that's younger than us. We have this understanding, this universal understanding of what it means to betray someone, to betray your own.
Yeah.
Christianity has Judas Iscariote,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The Spanish colonization of America has La Malinche for Mexico,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I mean, these are bad characters, right? They're infamous, they're notorious, right? But I think in telling that story, they're trying to share the value of sticking and being loyal to your own, right? To supporting a belief, a culture, a people. Um, and so, am I surprised that we're going to have people like Judas or a Malinche amongst the 40 million Mexicanos, Mexicans, Americans that live in the United States? No, I'm not surprised, right? I'm not surprised at all. Um, is it unfortunate? Yes. What's the reason? I would say yes, I agree with you, Minna. It is about insecurity, but it's also about fear and ignorance,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
They're afraid.
Yep.
Their way of, responding to this is not necessarily the type of response you and I or people with our points of view would look at something and respond to. They're going to react with fear. They're trying to be part of that oppressor group, right? Paulo Freire in his book writes about the oppressed. If you don't educate the oppressed, they will become the oppressor. And more so when you put a badge on and you become part of the authority, then you consider yourself part of that group, you belong to that group, and now you become part of the oppressor. And so it is a struggle between the oppressor, the oppressed, the haves, the have nots, the rich, the poor, and so on and so on and so on. But I think that is part of the reason why we have these MAGA supporters that have, and pardon this, el nopal en la frente.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I would also agree with when Aldo, when you talked about insecurity, like I would also say that it is much deeper than that. Like I think ultimately insecurity is a sign of fear, as Steve said. Like it is a sign of oppression. And I think part of being a minority in this country is the fact that we are an oppressed people, and we have limited job opportunities, we have limited resources. And so I think people will do what it takes. I think it tells a story of people who are oppressed, who are just trying to survive. And, like, I'm obviously not a MAGA Trump supporter, and but I do think it's important to see other people's point of view and their perspective and the why behind why they do it, right? Ultimately, education is what I think sets us free and, allows us to advance. And so I think when I think of MAGA Trump supporters or like why we have people that are, very Mexican or very, like that are trying to distance themselves from being Mexican. I think that that's part of it. Like, I think it's fear. I think it's oppression. I think it's systemic oppression. And when you have like systemic oppression, that's not a very easy thing to dismantle. And so I think people seek like their own remedy to that, right? And a lot of the times it is like putting on that badge and putting on, siding with, the power structure at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it's not just, Mexican American culture. I mean, you've had them in
Hmm.
other, like, for example, I think during the Holocaust, there was a group of Jews, I think they were called
Hmm.
capos, and they worked for the
Hmm.
Nazis. Now, there was
Yeah,
never a chance that they would ever be accepted as Nazis, but they were happy to do the bidding of the Nazis so that they could establish a little bit of a hierarchy over some of the other Jews. And, it's one of the more lamentable aspects of the Holocaust. But I think every ethnic group has dealt with something that's similar to this. I was shocked actually because I remember when Trump came out and announced his first candidacy, kind of descended down that elevator and called us rapists and criminals. I
hmm.
was laughing. I was laughing until that point. I thought it was funny. I thought he was, it was amusing.
The funny
But then he
guy.
said that, and I was just like livid. And then I started to mention this to, colleagues of mine, and I'd be like, and we'd be talking about who we're going to vote for and stuff like that, and they'd be saying things, and I'd go, I'm not voting. Some of them seemed like they were not going to, you know, uh, vote against Trump, and so I kind of mentioned I'm voting against the guy who called us Mexican, I mean, rapists and criminals, and they were like,
Right.
well, he meant undocumented
He meant
immigrants
Justification.
and some other, and
undocumented,
I'm
and
just
it's like,
going,
what?
he didn't say that. And even if he did, I mean, I'm sorry. I think we should have all taken exception. So you have you have those within our own community who are willing to cut and run and really don't have much of a connection, I think, or loyalty to the larger Mexican ethnic community. And I'm not saying we're all monolithic. We're not. There's so
Right.
many different shades, and throughout Mexico, even it's sort of a tapestry of regional cultures. And even within the Mexican American community, there's a lot of differences, but there's certain things that Trump has done that I think that should arouse outrage in just about anybody who's Mexican American, whether you're conservative, whether you're not, whether you favor strict immigration policies, stuff like that. Um, one thing I just wanted to kind of circle back to real quick. There was a time when perhaps naively, that I thought that, having this is, a decade or so ago, when I thought, well, having Mexican Americans in the ranks of the Border Patrol would help moderate some of the more controversial tendencies of the agency. And I thought, well, it's a good thing that there are Mexican
Mhm.
Americans because guess what? They're gonna help professionalize the agency and turn it hopefully into an apolitical law enforcement agency, or even kind of shift it left a little.
Hmm.
But I'm not sure that's what's happening. I think having Mexican American Border Patrol agents is simply legitimizing certain tendencies within the agency, it's normalizing a certain organizational culture, from what I understand, and I haven't done any formal research, but just based on my own anecdotal information. And ultimately, I think it's helping to normalize certain policies being pursued by the Trump administration. Some of us have complained about certain things that are going on, and when we come, but you're looking up at the on TV and you see the director of Border Patrol here in the El Paso sector is a Mexican American guy, and so
You said he
he
is?
I think he is, yeah,
Yeah.
pretty
Okay.
sure
A
he
lot of
is.
them, a lot of these regional directors are in fact
Oh yeah.
Mexican American.
Hmm.
Yeah. I remember the one in Laredo, Texas. He was Mexican American. Yeah.
Yeah.
Surprised, but
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. No, I
You
think
know,
Border Patrol. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, what I was going to mention was you said it could be good to have us in the ranks. And this immediately brought to mind, like in my conversation with Alejandro, I was talking to him because he served in so many government institutions, right? Like he was a police officer, border patrol, he was in the military, now he's an attorney. And so he really was deep in the government institution territory, right? And so one of the things that I remember he said was when you're in it, you kind of have this like group think and they kind of like train you. Training is a bad word, but there's almost like this
Conditioning.
indoctrination,
Yes.
yes,
Indoctrination. Yes.
indoctrination into this way of thinking. And so he said that he's like, there's not a lot of diversity in thought specifically. I remember he told me
Mm,
that. And so I think like when you put us into that environment, you are ultimately going to align yourself with whatever the groupthink is. And I think
mm,
that groupthink is ultimately going to be this like negative perception about immigrants and, like that we're criminals, these stereotypes, right, that exist. The other point that I wanted to make was it's interesting that the director was Mexican American, you mentioned. I would say that there are very few of them because in my research, what I also found was, we're kind of like part of the rank and file, but we're not really the leaders, right?
Mm,
So like, so
yeah.
I would say, we're not the majority of leadership. And so as you progress to the top, it gets more white,
mm.
in
Okay,
leadership.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
Interesting.
I definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah.
And I do want to ask a question. Um, as we talk about the story, and then you kind of, not that we're going to wrap it up, or I'm trying to wrap up the conversation, but you do kind of pose this question at the end of your story, which I think is brilliant, right? You end with a question, and you ask
Hmm. Hmm.
basically, why does America still insist that Latinos do not belong? And I think it's just, the way you wrap it up is perfect. But it's
Thank you.
also, I think, when I was reading that question, and my knee jerk reaction, to answer that question was, oh, it's simple. It's racism, right?
Hmm.
But you start diving deeper, and we've been around and we've read and I've seen trends being played out historically that go beyond racism, right? And I believe Mexican culture has been, and I think you're going to agree with me, has been intentionally, right, and systematically subordinated throughout the
Hmm.
history of the United States. I mean, you talk about the Spanish language being prohibited in public schools, right?
Hmm.
Segregation.
Hmm.
When it comes to the question of citizenship and patriotism, we're always it's always challenged if you're Mexican, if you're waving a Mexican flag. That I think has provided Anglo's a solid moral footing to rob us, to rob Mexican Americans of power and then to kick them out of public life, right? I mean, it's kind of by design. And as a result, I think we can all agree that we have become a subjugated people. And then going back to Octavio Paz when he talks about the Pachucos, I think he was talking about a group of people that were victims of these systemic changes, and so they lost their culture and themselves, right? And hereby, I mean by losing or lost, I mean they lost their way or path to fully appreciate and learn their culture and value their Mexican identity, which we go back to if you have a strong understanding of who you are,
Hmm.
then it doesn't really matter, right?
Right.
If you're told you don't belong, right? Because you understand that the system is in fact rigged against you, right? I remember being taught George Washington was my founding father and not Miguel Hidalgo, right? Um, but then the big problem becomes George Washington doesn't look like me, right? And my name is Jorge or Jose. It's not George, right? And to complicate one's life going to school, you're told not to speak English or to speak English only. Um, so it effectively cuts or limits your ability to communicate with other people in Mexico, right? Um, So it's interesting that you bring that up. And I'm just wondering how would you answer that question, Chelsea? I mean, what's your answer to that question that you posed?
Like I think it's a very layered issue, and I think a lot of it has to do with what you just said, right? Where Okay, I'll go back to I talked to one of the professors. I can't remember which professor told me this, but they said that America has a racial hierarchy. And in order for that racial hierarchy to work, it requires members of like the subordinate group to uphold that racial hierarchy, right? So in the way that we're talking about it, there are people that do that, right? There are people who are kind of like the token Mexican person who aligns with MAGA, for example, as part of the conversation. So I think race is a very, very like I think racism is like how I would answer that question. Um, Another point that I want to make in that you mentioned is like this is another thing that a professor told me is the stronger understanding you have of who you are and your identity, the more educated you are, essentially, the less you're going to align yourselves with these values, right, that we're talking about. Because then you start learning about the beauty of our culture, right? The leaders that we have, like people who look like us who have done great things. But the problem is that within America, we've been erased. Our contributions have been systemically erased. Um, I think about there was I cannot remember his last name. His name was Felipe Esparza, I believe. He was a soldier who died. I think that's his last name, in World War II. And when his body was brought back, a funeral home denied his family using that funeral home because they said that white people wouldn't like that. So I think we just have these historical examples of how we've never been accepted and we've always been denied the title of being fully American. I mean, even as we talk amongst ourselves, right? What do we call ourselves? We say we're Mexican American.
Yeah.
But then who gets to be called American, right? It's just white Americans. That's who gets the term white
Yeah.
American. So even that in the way that we speak is
Mhm.
upholding in a sense, right? That
Yeah.
like racial hierarchy. Even when you think of African Americans, why can't Black people be called, American, So even in
Yeah.
our language, we are upholding that. And I think ultimately it does come down to racism. I think, I mentioned Bad Bunny earlier. And I think the reason why I think it's such a great example is because there was a whole other halftime show dubbed the Great
Oh,
American
yeah.
Halftime Show
Yes.
featuring Kid Rock,
Oh,
Kid
what a
Rock.
joke.
Oh boy.
white performers, instead of
Ooh.
Bad
Yeah.
Bunny, because Bad
Yeah.
Bunny wasn't American. But Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. So to me, what does
Hmm.
that tell me? That our identity as Latinos is not good enough. It's not just simply American. We are not American. And so I think back to the article, right? You think of Alejandro and all of his service that he did, I mean, for the government. And even then, even after becoming an attorney, one of the examples he gave me is he said that when he got hired at one of the firms that he worked for, like people thought that he was like some type of assistant and they didn't know that he was an attorney. And so even there, or people will be like, I want to speak to the attorney. And he's like, I am the attorney. And so even after serving in the military, serving the government, becoming an attorney and doing all of this, he still has not been accepted. And so ultimately, what is the answer to that? It's race. It's the fact that he's not white and a white American. And I think that to me, that's how I would answer that question. But I think in the journalism, right? I want the reader to arrive to their own interpretation of what that means.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
segue into what I was going to ask you about now. During a previous conversation, you and I were discussing Patriot Front. And for people who aren't familiar with what Patriot Front is, on July 4th, this group, I think it's out of Grapevine, Texas, not far from Dallas. There's a lot of stuff like that in Texas, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
anyways, this organization believes that American identity, okay, is fundamentally racial or ethnic in nature. So, according to their definition, Mexican Americans, according to Patriot Front, can never be considered real Americans. And they've come out and kind of explicitly, they've made this very, very clear that this is what they believe. Mexican Americans or African Americans, or even, I think, even Jewish Americans,
Interesting.
can never really become Americans in their view. But it's not just Patriot Front. There's various neo-Nazi organizations out there. I call them kind of wannabe Nazis because they're not really Nazis, but there's the Atomwaffen Division, the Base, Identity Europe, Aryan Freedom Network, various border militias that are active in New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. And I was actually, people were like, oh, you've been talking about this a lot. And I'm going, well, I was actually delighted to see Patriot Front out marching because it gives people like me a chance to once again point out that echoes of the Patriot Front ideology are evident in MAGA ideology and in their rhetoric. And, these are central guiding elements of Trump's immigration enforcement policies.
Mm.
He's used language like, these immigrants are poisoning the blood of America. Well, that's Nazi talk, right? On and on and on. I mean, we would need a whole different episode to discuss the commonality between these. They used to be fringe ideologies. I don't really want to call them that anymore because they've kind of been embraced by MAGA. And so
Hmm.
I will concede any issue to any MAGA, Mexican American Trump supporter. Strict border enforcement, you got it. That's fine. Any type of economic argument you want to make, that's fine. But how do these people, and I've asked this question many a time, how do these people negotiate this reality of what MAGA is? Because the practical and what this means specifically for Mexican Americans who support Trump is that they're essentially endorsing an ideology or belief system that is premised on their own categorical subordination as a community. And I'm using subordination, to be kind of euphemistically, because I believe, I think that's a very generous word I'm using because I believe they're embracing their own subjugation. Because a lot of
Subjugation
the
is the
stuff
word.
that these people talk about in certain areas online and are pretty alarming. And I keep trying to tell people, okay, whatever you want, whatever. The border was never, immigration, it's the pros and cons of immigration are a different conversation. But here is one uh, aspect of MAGA that I'm still waiting for them to get back to me on this. And I've asked them, I go, yeah, well, what about this, this, and this? And in most cases, and we even talked about this, there's two types of MAGA support, Mexican American MAGA supporters. There's the kind that are sort of denotatively ignorant. I mean, they didn't know what the hell I was talking about when I was talking about Patriot Front or Adam Waffen or stuff like that, and or white supremacy. They have no idea. And then there's the others who may have an idea what it is, but are somehow able to kind of uh, deny the reality of these organizations and sort of rationalize it somehow. So that's been one of the more baffling aspects of Mexican American support for Trump. I go, I'll give you any other issue, whatever. How do you negotiate this particular aspect of Trumpism? And I don't know. Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, you know what I think it is? I think that when you think of yourself and the way you think politically, you're kind of thinking the identity or lens that you're using is like your Latino or Mexican American identity kind of comes to the forefront. And I remember there was Dr. Vega, from UC Irvine. She, in her book, talked about this thing called, I hope I remembered it, defensive nationalism. And she said that our identities are situational. And so, because her work studies Border Patrol agents and how they reconcile being Border Patrol agents, right? And, also being Latinos. And so she said that because our identities are situational, they're not thinking of themselves as Latinos first, as Mexican Americans first. They're thinking of themselves as American. And this is something that it's also in the article because when I talked to Alejandro, I asked him, when you were, a Border Patrol agent, did you see yourself in the immigrants that you were stopping, that you were, and he said, no, I saw myself as American. I saw myself as different. I did not see myself in them. And so I think to answer your question, I think that MAGA has done a really good job of convincing people that American is a separate identity than like your race. You know what I mean? A nationality is different than the race, even though, arguably it's very intertwined. It could be different, but it's very intertwined. And so I think when these Latino or Mexican American Trump supporters are, saying that that this aligns with their values, I think that they're separating their Latino identity. And that's when I think that their American comes to the forefront.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah. I can guarantee you these groups don't see it that way. I'm
Oh,
sure they
yeah, I mean, that's a
they're
whole
the
other
ones,
thing, right?
yes, they see them as somebody who
Yeah.
can never be an American.
Of course, of course. And I think that that's again, like I mentioned this point earlier, right? Is that America does have a racial hierarchy, and in order for that racial hierarchy to exist, it requires people in the subordinate groups to uphold that hierarchy. That was one of the professors told me that, and I thought that was like so fascinating, because I was like, it's so true. And so, similar to Alejandro in this story, where he was never going to be American, regardless of how
Mhm.
much he did. I think it's similar, right? Like, you're never gonna be fully accepted, but as long as you can, play along and, perform, as many like there's politicians and political commentators that are Mexican American that, align with those values, and they're to some extent never going to make it to the very top. You know what I mean? Because they're performing within that racial hierarchy and they're going to be closer to the top, but you're never going to be fully at the top because you're never going to fully be accepted. And I think that that's something that maybe, you don't internalize when you're in that position. But I think, yeah, I think that's a piece of it.
You talk about MAGA, and I think when you talk about MAGA supporters, right? Very different from Alejandro. Alejandro doesn't get to choose if America um, accepts him or not. That's not his choice.
Mhm.
He doesn't get to choose that, right? In the case that you want to be a MAGA supporter and subscribe to the MAGA philosophy and ideology, that's a choice. You're choosing, right? And like you said, you're choosing and you're choosing even against yourself, your own survival, your own people, right? There's a degree of responsibility for those folks. And I think we need to uphold uphold them to that standard of, what you're doing is you're engaging in the wrong choice. And two, how do you deal with people that are going to, that despite the information and the education, that they still want to become MAGA supporters, they still subscribe to the extremism of MAGA ideology. And I think the answer for me is you don't try to educate them, you just try to fight them. Fight fire with fire at
Yeah.
this point. with Nazism, I mean, you got so
Yeah.
many examples of how Nazi raided the world and where some countries were willing to take the knee and willing
Yeah.
to cooperate and become an ally of the Nazis. Take, for example, Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainians said, yes, we'll help you fight the Russians. We hate the Russians, even though Ukraine was part of Russia, right? And yet the Nazis said, no, we're going to kill
Yeah.
you guys. Instead of
Mhm.
helping you guys and you helping us eliminate the Russians, we're going to kill you guys. And that's what they did.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, these extreme political ideologies, I think
Yeah.
the only way to beat them is you fight fire with fire,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's a good example because some people, there's this book called The Destruction of the European Jews that I read once. And basically they said the problem was the Jews kept making excuses. Okay, they were things were happening, life was getting complicated, and they continued to basically accommodate the requests of the regime. And eventually that led to their destruction. Obviously, I think our situation is radically different because we have a lot of people who, right out of the gate, are not accommodating the regime. Plus,
Mm.
it's Trump. It's clown show fascism. So I'm not meaning to, dismiss it as it can be very dangerous. I don't mean to make it sound like they're
Good.
not, but thank God they're such bumbling idiots because otherwise, we've just got to be alert. We've got to be attentive to this situation. And so. Yeah, any very interesting conversation, guys. I think we could probably keep this going for hours. However, let's take one more break and we will be right back with our final segment called Drug of Choice. You are listening to Vanguard Elements.
You are listening to Vanguard Elements, the alternative Mexican-American voice of the Southwest. The views and opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the individual expressing those views and opinions, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any affiliated organization, employer, or institution. Thank you for supporting independent Mexican-American media.
Welcome back. So we have a segment on this podcast which we call Drug of Choice, in which each of the panel members recommend or discuss a news story, podcast, political candidate, or other item that they believe is worthy of attention. I like to explain the title a bit because I don't want people to think that we're promoting illicit drug use. But maybe we are. Who knows? Maybe we are promoting illicit drug use. We are all sort of information and news junkies, right? And so, what drug are we currently into in the figurative sense of the word? Um, who wants to go first? Steve, you want to go first?
Well, let me go first, if that's okay. I don't want to steal no one's thunder here. I know there's a very very uh, I guess tragic event that has caught the attention of all of us, and I so I'm not going to talk about that, but maybe one of you guys will talk about it. But I do want to talk about two books that I think are relevant and are important to kind of just keep on diving into this topic of identity. And the first book, obviously, the in our conversation, I quoted El laberinto de la soledad by Octavio Paz. Again, it's a book that he wrote back in the 40s, 50s, but I think his observations of Mexican life were spot on, and specifically his interpretation of what he saw through his lens at that time about Mexican Americans consider themselves, the Pachucos at that time, what they were going through, and his observations about um, the lacking of cultural identity that I think is still relevant, as Chelsea has kind of highlighted in her story about Alejandro. The second book I would also recommend is by Carlos Fuentes, another Mexican author, um, who wrote El Espejo Enterrado, the Buried Mirror. It's an interesting, very, very interesting book. One again that I think tackles this issue of identity in a very poetic way as well. And he talks about, what's interesting is he talks about the border being a scar, right? It's a scar. And to be able to kind of, paint the border as a scar, I think is spot on. Um, because it is, we're just talking about traumas, right? And it is a trauma that's been part of who we are and of our identity. So, yeah, that's what I recommend to our listeners. Those two books, El laberinto de la soledad by Octavio Paz and El espejo enterrado by Carlos Fuentes.
Thank you for that. Chelsea?
Let's see. I mean, for me, I think like I've been diving into, I think the obvious. A few days ago, there was a shooting, an ICE shooting in Houston. Lorenzo Salgado Araujo is what I
Mhm.
wrote down his name. He was a 52-year-old man. He had been in the United States for 35 years, three kids, a wife. He was headed to his job and he was shot and killed by ICE. So I really wanted to bring up that story to obviously bring awareness to his death. But also it reminded me so much of what happened with Renee Good. Because it was a similar story told by ICE agents. So they said that he attempted to use his vehicle to like hurt the agent somehow, and so the agent fired in self-defense. So the story's pretty new. Not a lot has came out. But I think it's important for us to because what I think is so disheartening is like the fact that even and this is even with what happened to Renee Good, there was another gentleman who got shot and killed. What was his name? Do you guys
Pretty,
remember?
right? Last name was Pretty.
Yes,
Alex
P-R-E-T-T-I.
Preddy.
Alex
Alex.
Pretty. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So when those deaths happened, I mean, it ignited a storm
Mm.
across, the US, protests everywhere. But what a lot of people don't realize is there was deaths before that by
Oh,
ICE.
yeah.
Oh
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, and there was another man, his name was Silverio, I believe, Gonzalez, who was also killed by ICE prior to Renee Good and Alex Pretty. And our stories are just so often ignored by the media.
Yes.
I mean, our
Yes.
erasure is part of like the systemic oppression that we have, right? Is the
Hmm.
fact that when something happens to brown people and black people, right? Because black people experience the same thing, we get ignored by the media. And so I think right now, that's why I bring up his story. I think it's important for us to like share it so that we could all come together as a community.
Mm.
But also because, that there is a systemic erasure of our stories and there is this like oppression that we face within the media where the media, decides like our stories aren't of value. And so I think, the more that we can share on social media, everybody has a platform now. And no matter how small your account is, you have the ability to spread information just like somebody else. And so I think it's important for us to share information and stick together as a community. So yeah, that's mine that I wanted to share.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Um, I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but I'd like people to go and support InfoWars on the Onion YouTube channel. I can't believe
Mm.
I'm saying this, but
What are you
uh,
saying?
what am I saying?
Have you lost your mind?
Yeah, no, go and check out InfoWars on the Onion YouTube channel. I don't know if, for the sake of our any listeners who might not know what InfoWars is, this was a media organization founded, I think, in the late 90s by Texas broadcaster Alex Jones. Like I said, a lot of
Ooh.
shit going on in Texas. Um, Over time, however, the outlet became kind of widely known for promoting conspiracy theories and false claims and, really fucking vile shit. But one of the worst things it did, you guys remember the Sandy Hook shooting? I think they shot
Tragedy.
up, it was an
Yeah.
elementary school. It was just terrible.
Terrible.
Hmm.
And they basically Alex Jones through InfoWars basically made it seem like these guys were this was all a hoax, and him and his followers would harass the
Yeah.
families of these, the surviving
What a
parents.
crazy mofo.
It was terrible, and just I can't think of anything worse somebody could do. But
I think those families ended up suing, right? And like
right,
winning
They
exactly.
did.
because they were being
Yes,
harassed. Yeah.
yes,
Insane.
absolutely. They sued,
And
they
they won.
won,
Hmm.
and InfoWars, Alex Jones, I guess he declared bankruptcy. So what the court ordered was for him to put aspects of his intellectual property up for sale to kind of, because I think he owes them like,
Mm.
I forget how much money he has to
It was
pay
a
out,
lot.
like over $1 billion, if I'm not
Yeah, it was a
mistaken.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot. Hmm.
A
And
lot of
so
Benjis.
The Onion. We all know and love The Onion. I love The
Mm-hmm.
Onion. And so they managed to acquire the InfoWars brand, and they consulted with the Sandy Hook families when they did this. Okay, they wanted to let them know that we're gonna start acquiring intellectual property from InfoWars. They haven't got the domain name yet, but that's coming, I believe. Right now, and so they've got the InfoWars branding and stuff like that. And so they've done a parody of InfoWars, and any proceeds they generate from people buying merchandise from the Onion, associated with this, they're donating back to the Sandy Hook families, which is a very admirable thing to do.
That's awesome.
It is.
And so yeah, they're gonna direct proceeds from their new parody site to the family, the Sandy Hook families. It's wonderful. In the debut episode of The Onion's new Info Wars parody, it's like a little show. Um, it opens with a fictional scenario in which Alex Jones is killed as part of the satire. It shows him eating Whataburgers because Whataburgers big in Texas. So he's eating Whataburgers, keeps eating and then blows up or something like that. It's hilarious. So check it out, guys. Can't believe I'm saying that, but go and check out InfoWars on the Onion YouTube channel, please.
That's interesting, man. I am going to
Yeah.
check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Get
So
some
guys,
laughs.
Chelsea, before we call it a night, if our listeners would like to follow your work, what's the best way for them to do that? Where can they find you online?
Yes. My main platform is Instagram at it's Chelsea Vega. You can find me there. That's the platform I use mostly, but I'm going to expand eventually. I started a podcast. I did a whole episode and then I said, wow, this podcast took a lot of work.
Yes,
So,
we
so I
know.
commend, I
Yes,
know,
we
so I
understand.
commend you guys for what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I will eventually pick that back up and it'll be on YouTube. But for now,
Cool.
I'm focusing on just growing my Instagram. If you listen to this podcast and you're not familiar with me, this is like a whole serious side of me. And on my Instagram, you'll find kind of like a mix of humor and education, I like to say. I don't like to be boxed in. I mentioned it earlier. And so I think I like to channel different aspects of my personality. I have a serious side. I have a side that really loves learning and education. And so you'll find educational carousels on there, but then you'll also catch me being kind of a troll and being funny and sharing my humor. So if you're interested in that, definitely give me a follow at it's Chelsea Vega on Instagram.
All right.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you both for being here. And Chelsea, I just want to say that we are at your service. If there's
Thank
ever
you.
anything you need from us, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Let's definitely keep in touch. Okay, guys. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank
Keep
you.
up the great work, Chelsea.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Vanguard Elements, the alternative Mexican American voice of the Southwest. For additional information, please follow us on X at SolidarityWMEX or visit our website at solidaritywithmexico.org. Please also check out our affiliated online publication, Fronterizo Magazine, at fronterizonews.com. Thank you for supporting independent Mexican American media.